Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
There were basically three headwaters, if you will, of the mainstream of early American constitutionalism. The first was classical republicanism. There we mean Greece and Rome. Rome, particularly of the Republican period that lasted nearly 500 years. Then there was Enlightenment liberalism, and there we mean, in particular, British liberalism. And we think of figures such as John Locke and Algernon Sidney, two men, by the way, whom Jefferson pointed to by name as influences on his draft of the Declaration of Independence. And then that third stream, or headwater, if you will, of the mainstream is Christianity, Protestant Christianity in particular, and even further, what we would call Reformed Christianity, meaning Calvinistic Christianity, those denominations who were descended from John Calvin. And religion played an important, even a vital role in forming early American constitutionalism, but that role was an informal one. The framers of our Constitution intentionally created a regime that would be religion blind, if you will. And there's a reason that God, for example, doesn't appear in the Constitution as references to the deity do in the preceding organic laws, such as the Declaration of Independence. So an informal role, one that during the Revolutionary period, for example, helped to provide arguments for resistance against tyrannical rulers. And in particular, the founders were counting on religion to produce good Republican citizens, Republican with a small r, democratical citizens, if you will. And George Washington probably said it best in his farewell address when he said that religion and morality are indispensable supports of Republican government. Again, religion played a vital role in bringing on the American Revolution, and here we can turn to John Adams for support. Adams, of course, was a leading revolutionary himself, and he said, looking back on that revolutionary period at a distance of nearly 50 years, who will believe that the apprehension of episcopacy, the fear of bishops, in other words, helped to bring on the American Revolution? And he says, nevertheless, this is a fact as certain as any in history. And he went on to say, this is how religion affected the American Revolution. By the way, Adams defined the revolution as much more than just the war. He said the revolution actually occurred years prior to fighting. And he said it was a revolution in the hearts and minds of the American people, a change in their religious sentiments, he said. Adams said, here is how Americans were thinking in that run-up to the Revolutionary War. They were afraid that English bishops were going to be imposed on American churches, and that was a legitimate fear, by the way. And Adams said, this is how Americans started thinking. If England can impose bishops over our churches, then they can establish the entire hierarchy of the Church of England. They can start to forbid marriages and funerals if they're not done under the proper church auspices. They can make schism heresy, he said, and they can introduce this entire hierarchy. And so Adams was convinced that this fear of English episcopacy or bishoprics was a key factor in bringing on the revolution. And he said it caused Americans, both elites and common folk, to close constitutional thinking about their place in the empire. There is a marvelous cartoon that was published in 1768-69, and it shows Americans driving an English bishop from the American shores. And he's climbing up the rigging of a ship to return to Britain. And the Americans there are driving him away by throwing books at him. They also say things like, no lord spiritual or temporal in New England. And that's sort of a play on the House of Lords, which had secular lords, but it also had spiritual lords. The English bishops in the Church of England got seats in the House of Lords. The books that these Americans, these New Englanders, are throwing at the English bishop are Locke on government, Sidney on government. Again, these are two people whom Thomas Jefferson pointed by name as influences on the Declaration of Independence. But the third one, the book that's open and that is about to strike the bishop in the back of the head, is Calvin's works. Calvin's works. So, although Jefferson left Calvin off of his list of people, he mentioned Aristotle and Cicero and Locke and Sidney as authors of books of public right who informed our Declaration of Independence. Calvin is there, and the author, the illustrator of this cartoon captures that in this drawing, and it's a marvelous visual kind of representation of these various streams, as I've referred to them, or headwaters that were at work during the Revolutionary period. We think of the 18th century as Thomas Paine, for example, called it, the Age of Reason. And there's good reason to call it the Age of Reason. It was the Age of Enlightenment. But we must always remember that it was also the Age of Awakening. And during particularly the 1740s and 50s, those decades that immediately preceded the American Revolution, there was a religious phenomenon that swept the colonies from north to south. And it burned brightest during those 40s and 50s. And there were two individuals that we tend to associate with that. George Whitefield, who was an English clergyman, an Anglican in fact, an evangelical Anglican who came to America numerous times to preach and evangelize. And then an American, Jonathan Edwards, who eventually would come to what's now Princeton University to become its president. But those two, Edwards and Whitefield, were sort of the spearheads of the Great Awakening. And this was a movement that cut across all kinds of barriers, if you will. It cut across racial barriers. It cut across class barriers. It cut across geographical barriers. And it was a phenomenon that was much reported in the press. In fact, there are contemporary scholars who call the Great Awakening our first national media event, for example. So I think there's a very real sense in which an incipient sense of nationhood begins to develop during these decades of the Great Awakening. And it does something else too. It creates in Americans a sense that perhaps age-old authorities can and should be undermined. For example, many people during this awakening period have what they consider to be an immediate experience of God's grace. They go to hear George Whitefield, for example, a very powerful preacher who loved the common folk and had built for him a portable pulpit that he would set up in the middle of a field, for example, and thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people would gather to hear him preaching. And he had to do that because he was refused the pulpits of the established churches, particularly the Anglican churches, of which he was a member. And they would stand there in these fields and they would hear Whitefield preach to them directly from the scriptures of God's grace. And they had experiences. And they felt that they were experiencing God afresh directly. And they didn't depend on a clerical class. They didn't depend on an authority structure for that experience. And I think that the popular religiosity of the Great Awakening was translated in subsequent decades, the 1760s and 70s, into the popular constitutionalism that we see Americans articulating, that authorities in the state, perhaps, are not necessary any more than they are in the church. And consent, the doctrine of consent of essentially equal people. And recall our Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men are created equal, has its roots in that Great Awakening of the 1740s and 50s. And I think a case can be made that the popular religiosity of the Great Awakening and its incipient sense of nationalism translate into the popular constitutionalism of the Revolutionary period. The Constitution is silent on the issue of God, except for a an oblique reference at the end to "in the year of our Lord," or Anno Domini in the Latin. But that was intentional. And the reason for that is one word that we contemporary Americans aren't very familiar with anymore, and it's the word federalism. Federalism. Now, when we hear the word federal, we tend to think of the national government. We think of the government in Washington, D.C., for example. But when our founders used the word federal or federalism, federal in particular, they meant a sort of confederation, a confederal government, where there were constituent parts, the states, that were very strong actors, in fact, semi-sovereign actors. So they left God out of the Constitution, as it were, because that was a matter for the states. Religion was considered to be a state issue. And during the constitutional period of the 1780s, some of the states had established religions. Massachusetts, for example, Congregationalism was established. Some of the states had no religion. Rhode Island, for example, is a famous case where there was a separation of church and state, as we tend to say nowadays. So religion is under the purview of the states, and that's why it doesn't appear in the federal Constitution, a constitution that creates a regime which is, in James Madison's words, partly federal and partly national. But it falls under what are sometimes called the police powers, health and safety and morals. These were under the control of the states, so religion is a state matter. It's not that the founders were unconcerned about religion or that they thought it was unimportant, but they saw it as a potentially divisive force at the federal level. But more to the point, they thought that was properly under the control of the states. So that's why it doesn't appear in the Constitution. Late in his life, James Madison wrote that the belief in a God all-powerful, wise, and good is so essential to the moral order of society and the happiness of mankind that arguments for his existence cannot be drawn from too many quarters. Madison thought that belief in God was vital to a healthy republic, but Madison was also a very strong religious libertarian, we might say. So he didn't want to see any kind of establishment at the federal level imposed on the American people, but he did want a regime of liberty where churches could do their good work of producing Republican citizens and work in an informal fashion, or we might say a pre-political fashion, or even a pre-constitutional fashion. To recur again to George Washington's metaphor, that architectural metaphor of religion as producing morality and being an indispensable support or prop of Republican government. Madison saw religion similarly, but he thought the government should be, again, religion blind, or it should not take cognizance of religion. The conscience is under the control of the individual and God alone. God alone is Lord of the conscience, as the Westminster Confession of Faith said. A document produced by the English reformers came out of the Westminster District of London there. And James Madison, incidentally, was trained by almost exclusively Calvinist ministers. The tutors he had as a youngster, the headmaster of the boarding school where he went, Reverend Donald Robertson, his principal mentor at college, the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, all of them Calvinist ministers. So Madison sort of took in this understanding of God alone being Lord of the conscience. And it's not the government's job to tell us what to believe in religious matters, or to either favor us or impose penalties on us, civil penalties or disabilities because of what we believe. Madison is a very strong religious libertarian, if you will. James Madison was at the center of the creation of the First Amendment. He had had a lifelong affinity for religious liberty. He was a strong religious libertarian, we might say. And following the ratification of the Constitution, Madison, having helped father that document, we call him the father of the Constitution for good reason, wanted to take part in that new government. He wanted to sit in that first federal Congress. But politics being what it was in those days, the most influential political actor in Virginia was Patrick Henry, and Henry and Madison were on the outs. Henry made sure that Madison was not going to be appointed to the Senate, so that left him the House of Representatives. And the Henryites ran a very compelling candidate against Madison, and his name was James Monroe. Monroe was later to succeed Madison as President of the United States. But at this time, they were political opponents. Madison was small. He had a very weak voice. He wasn't a powerful presence. Monroe was tall, authoritative-looking. He was a war hero. In fact, he'd been wounded during the Revolution in New Jersey. And if you're familiar with that idealistic painting by Emanuel Leutze of Washington crossing the Delaware, it's James Monroe who was holding the American flag there. So in order to be the best candidate he could be against James Monroe, Madison had to shift his position on the Bill of Rights. Initially, during the Constitutional Convention and in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Madison was opposed to a national Bill of Rights. He thought it was inappropriate and even dangerous, for reasons we'll get to in a moment. And during their contest for the House of Representatives from Virginia, Monroe hinted that James Madison was actually not such a strong proponent of religious liberty as he claimed to be. And he said, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he didn't fight for a Bill of Rights. And if you elect me, James Monroe, especially you Baptists, who are a religious minority, I'll fight to make sure we get a Bill of Rights that protects your religious liberty. Now, Madison had been outraged as a young man to see Baptists carted off to jail and having to preach through the bars. So it wasn't that he was unconcerned about religious liberty. He was as fierce a champion or fiercer than Monroe. But he had to counter this argument to win that election. And so he, Madison, reluctantly said, all right, if you elect me, I too will work for a Bill of Rights. He narrowly defeated Monroe, he made it to that first Congress, and he felt duty-bound, honor-bound to honor that promise to the Baptists. And also there was some political reason for doing it as well. There were still opponents of that Constitution who were now sitting in the Congress and who were agitating for a second constitutional convention. And Madison feared that all of that hard work and compromise of the summer of 1787 might be undone. And so, as a political maneuver, he thought it would be wise for the friends of the Constitution, if we had to have a Bill of Rights, better to have the friends of the Constitution craft it in such a way that it wouldn't affect the powers of the new federal government. And so, in Madison's view, even though it was inappropriate and perhaps dangerous, a Bill of Rights could make explicit what was already implicit in that unamended Constitution, namely that this was a government of delegated powers. And so that's how the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights as a whole came about. Madison pulled together some of the various provisions in state constitutions that had their own bills of rights and sort of boiled them down to a manageable number and introduced them into the Congress and became in fact the ramrod to help get them through and passed by the first Congress. In Washington's phrase, it was thought to be, religion, thought to be one of two pillars really, or two legs we might say, that supported the American Republican superstructure. And religion was one and education was the other. As Washington said in that 1796 farewell address, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that a nation should be moral without religion. He said, you might find a mind of peculiar structure. You might find an odd individual. And scholars and people at the time thought perhaps he was sort of pointing at Jefferson because Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's great rival, had a hand in crafting that farewell address. Minds of a peculiar structure might be inclined to be moral, but you can't expect an entire nation to be moral without religion. This was an axiomatic belief amongst the founders. Even someone like Jefferson, who was religiously very unorthodox, very non-traditional, and in fact was a very harsh critic of revealed religion and Christianity in particular, even Jefferson said that the firmest guarantee of the liberties of a nation was a belief in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated without His wrath. So religion plays an important role, I think even a vital role, but it's an informal role. It's a supporting role, as it were.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.